Up to this point, we have dealt with the idea of taking the square root or the cube root of a variety of numbers, but we've mentioned several times that it's impossible to take the square root of a negative number. However, today we're going to introduce a concept that now allows us to represent this value. We are going to define something called I. I is defined to be equal to the square root of -1. The best way to use I is when you're dealing with something that like this, the square root of 8, and you see a negative underneath the radical, immediately pull out an I, and then you can take the square root as you would have previously. We would factor the 8 into 4 times 2, which becomes 2 times 2 times 2. Because it's a square root, we're looking for groups of 2. So this would become 2I square root of 2. Another example of how you might use the square root of I, or I'm sorry, the square root of a negative number, is if you had perhaps the square root of -18. Immediately upon seeing that negative under the radical, take out an I, and then again we factor the 18 into 9 times 2. We have 3 times 3 times 2. We have a group of 2, which gives us 3I square root of 2. Where you have to be careful is sometimes you end up with something like this, perhaps the square root of -8 times the square root of -2. Be careful not to multiply those together first, because you'll notice that would come out to the square root of 16, which is a real number. However, what we instead do is take out an I, and this becomes I square root of 8 times I square root of 2. We have already calculated the square root of I to be square root of 8 to be 2I square roots of 2 times I square root of 2. So we end up with 2I squared square root of 4, or we end up with 4I squared. In just a minute, we're going to learn that this I squared can be represented by a different value, and this actually comes out to be -4. So how did that I squared become negative? Well, you have 4 values of I that you need to know. If you have I to the first power, it's simply represented as I. If you have I to the second power, that is actually -1. And the reason that's true is because I squared is really just the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. And remember, the square root squared just makes the square root disappear. I cubed is nothing more than I squared times I to the first. So that becomes -1 times I. So I cubed is -I. And last but not least, I to the fourth is I squared times I squared, which is -1 times -1, which is 1. I highly recommend that you memorize these 4 values. I to the first is I squared is -1, I cubed is -I, and I to the fourth is +1. This becomes important because now if you have I to any power, you can simply take that power, divide it by 4, because each group of 4 is equal to 1. 4 goes into 25 times with a remainder of 3. This becomes I now to the third power, which we know is -1.